people of this nation have spoken.
What does the election of Joe Biden mean for the environment and the fight to rein in climate change? This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier.
Now this campaign is over. What is the will of the people? What is our mandate? I believe it's this. Americans have called upon us to marshal the forces of decency, the forces of fairness, to marshal the forces of science, and the forces of hope.
President-elect Biden ran as a moderate Democrat, but he also campaigned on an aggressive climate platform. How much of that agenda he can pursue could rest on who controls the U.S. Senate, pending the results of 2 runoff elections in Georgia. We're going to dig down into the details of what kinds of policies the president-elect could enact after he becomes president in January. We'll unpack all of this with Jody Freeman, law professor and director of the Environmental and Energy Law program at Harvard Law School. Before that, she worked in the Obama White House as counselor for climate and energy, where she was the architect for fuel efficiency regulations for cars, which were later rolled back under President Trump. Professor Freeman, welcome.
Great to be with you.
Can we just get your overall impressions of the results from the election?
Well, I mean, more broadly, of course, this is a massive change in terms of everything people care about, COVID-19 and the economy. But in our domain, energy, climate, environment, this is going to be a huge shift back in the direction of promoting clean energy. The Trump administration, as you know, spent 4 years unraveling climate regulations and environmental protection. And so the Biden administration has a big task ahead of it, which is to rebuild what has essentially been completely dismantled. I expect the Biden folks very quickly to issue executive orders on climate change and energy policy, just like they will issue a spate of orders on other things. I'd expect, first of all, the president to announce that he plans to rejoin the United States to the Paris Agreement, because that's something the president can do unilaterally, doesn't need Congress, doesn't need a lot of process. Secondly, I would expect him to direct the agencies, principally the EPA, but also the Department of the Interior and Department of Energy and others, to take steps to revisit regulations that the Trump administration weakened. Regulations that have to do with climate change, regulations that have to do with all dimensions of environmental protection. So that will take some time, but those rulemakings are things that the executive branch is in charge of, and they don't need Congress to do it. And then there's another set of things we can talk about which are harder, which would require legislation, and that's going to depend on whether the Senate is in Republican hands or if maybe the Democrats pull off 2 victories in the runoff in Georgia with Kamala Harris in position to cast the tie-breaking vote. That's a different scenario.
So one of the things Joe Biden has pledged to do is to return to the Paris Climate Accords. I'm sure that will garner a lot of attention, but how important is it? What does it do for climate action in the United States?
I think rejoining the Paris Agreement will be part of a re-engagement with the international community. You know, Trump withdrew the U.S., was a very isolationist position, a go-it-alone position. And I think the Biden administration, by rejoining the Paris Agreement, is going to signal to the world that the United States is committed to a global solution to climate change. And the United States will have to bring a new pledge or a new promise that it will be doing things at home to fulfill its obligation. That's what the international community will expect. But the change in tone, the change in leadership, the willingness to be part of an international process, you know, it's very important. And with the U.S. back at the table, the rest of the world will be invited and to some extent pressured and leveraged to come along. But the U.S. has to do its part. It's going to have to make a pledge that is serious and ambitious. I think the Biden administration is prepared to do that.
Let's kind of go to the base case, which is Biden doesn't have a Democratic Senate, or, you know, even if he gains a narrow majority. What does all that mean for advancing his climate agenda?
So the Biden campaign put out very ambitious goals. One is for the U.S. economy to meet net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And the other is to have a carbon-free electricity sector by 2035. And most people believe that to accomplish those goals, you would need new laws. So you would need Congress to be part of the process. So people talk about a carbon tax that could be passed. They talk about a cap or a limit on GHG emissions economy-wide, with perhaps a market trading scheme for allowances for those emissions beneath that cap. There are lots of design issues here, design questions, but there are a variety of ways to accomplish a national limit on greenhouse gas emissions. The other possibility is something more targeted, like a national clean energy standard that would basically incentivize more deployment of clean energy in the electricity sector. So there are a lot of policy possibilities, but for the biggest, most ambitious programs, you really do need Congress. I can tell you some of the things that Biden could do without the Congress, but that's why people are worried, because without the Democrats in control of the Senate, it's going to be very difficult to get this sort of expansive legislation passed, and they might have to do more targeted things. So a couple ideas come to mind. One is, first of all, a big infrastructure bill or a COVID recovery bill that could contain a lot of investment and support for clean energy as part of those bills, and I think that's a real possibility. And the other smaller piece that might be doable even with Republican control is something like a clean energy standard, because a lot of states have renewable portfolio standards trying to encourage renewable energy in their states, including some red states. So there might be bipartisan support for something like that.
So some bipartisan action is possible. How likely is it, I guess?
You know, it's very hard, right? We have to wait and see if Mitch McConnell is in fact leader of the Senate still, if Mitch McConnell is still going to pursue his obstructionist tactics. We saw those in the Obama years. It depends whether Joe Biden has the relationship people claim that he has had historically with McConnell, where they can do business together. A lot of people are skeptical about that. They think the politics may make it impossible to do deals across partisan lines. It's hard to handicap right now. There's so much unknown. But I do think there will be pockets of potential cooperation, even if it's a Republican-controlled Senate, because it will be close. And that means the Democrats might be able to attract to their side a couple or three, even one or two Republican votes for climate or energy bills will make the difference. But I think the big dream of a massive, expansive climate bill probably has to be adjusted if the Republicans control the Senate, and you might have to do it in bite-sized pieces and take modest or more incremental steps in the same direction.
Okay, so let's talk about what Biden could do without congressional action, just through, running the executive branch of the federal government. What are some things that you foresee? We know that President Trump has done a lot of rollbacks of Obama-era administration regulations, like, for instance, the Clean Power Plan, which regulated emissions from the power sector for greenhouse gases. What do you see as some of the possibilities?
I think that the Biden administration is going to go back to the Obama-era approach, but I think they're going to strengthen those standards, because in the meantime, we've seen technology develop and we've seen industry make a lot of progress on more efficient ways to produce electricity, more efficient ways to produce cars. There's been a lot of progress that new standards can build upon. So I see the Biden administration going back and replacing the Clean Power Plan with another set of standards for the power sector. I see them going back and reinforcing the fuel efficiency standards. At the time when Obama adopted them, they were historic, to a double fuel efficiency essentially by 2025. And I would see the Obama standards being the starting point for a Biden administration, and they will strengthen those standards for the transportation sector. And I see them probably revisiting the methane rules for methane leaks from oil and gas operations, setting standards for methane because it's such a powerful greenhouse gas, even more powerful than CO2. And across the board, I think what you'll see is a suite of greenhouse gas rules affecting sectors of the economy or subsectors of the economy that will add up to some real progress, but it will be through regulation. It will be principally under the Clean Air Act. Most of those rules will be legally challenged, and so the agencies will have to be strategic and careful in how they write these rules and make sure that they're going to withstand legal scrutiny. Yeah,
let's talk about that. So what does the new 6-3 makeup of the court mean for those kinds of inevitable challenges should the Biden administration put forward more stringent climate regulations?
What I would say about that is the court was already growing skeptical of ambitious agency rules, especially ambitious EPA rules, and particularly greenhouse gas rules. So even before Amy Coney Barrett was recently added to the court, there was reason to worry that if challenges to EPA rules made it to the Supreme Court, that it might be hard to get 5 votes in favor of supporting the agency's rules. So the agency already, EPA in particular, but all the government agencies are kind of on notice that they have to be cautious about their rulemakings, try not to do something so novel or expansive as to attract the withering skepticism of a Supreme Court that looks askance at expansive use of agency power, and instead kind of hit the ball in the fairway, or color in the lines, if you like, and make rules that are very carefully and well supported by the record about technology, record about economics, record about the agency's legal authority, and go in there and defend those rules. I think there's a good chance that the Biden administration is going to do a great job at this, really good lawyering. The Trump administration did a terrible job defending their rules. They built flimsy records. They were set back by the courts time and time again. Their rules were struck down for sloppy legal procedures. I mean, they really did a poor job. I think the Biden team is going to go in there with a view to making it through the courts with a nice set of regulations that they feel comfortable with.
If you were on the team writing those regulations, what are some of the kinds of things that you would try to work towards to be extra careful about having an Amy Coney Barrett or Neil Gorsuch be okay with your regulation?
Well, first thing I'd do is just make sure, and the lawyers at EPA and lawyers in the Department of Justice are excellent at this, is make sure that the statutory authority, the legal authority, is solid. Make sure they have strong arguments based on the text of the law that they're empowered to do these things, and then build these really robust records, because all of the agency's rules are reviewed under a standard of arbitrary or capriciousness. So they have to be careful to show that they're being rational and they're making strong decisions based on the evidence. I have complete faith that the Biden team at the Department of Justice, the Biden team at EPA and other agencies is going to be very good at this. But what it means is, the most novel legal approaches, maybe something inventive and new, anything that looks like it's creating a brand new undiscovered authority will come in for close scrutiny, because these judges are so textualist. As you know, you keep hearing talk of Amy Coney Barrett being such a strong textualist. Well, many of them subscribe, of course, to textualism. So I think it's important to root the agency's power in the text of the statutes.
So you were in the Obama administration writing, being the architect of the clean car standards about a decade ago. What do you think has changed in the last 10 years that might make it different for a Biden administration?
That's a great question. And when you say 10 years ago, it makes me feel very old, Reed. It's sad for me that all this time has elapsed. But what I would say about that is what's changed actually goes in the direction of the industry appreciating they need to make more fuel-efficient cars. Some in the industry, like Ford and others, have committed to making more fuel-efficient cars. They didn't support the rollback of these standards by the Trump administration. You remember there was a lot of conflict over this, and some very powerful voices in the industry didn't want to see these standards unraveled. They were already committed to making a fleet that was more efficient. So I would expect that the way that technology has developed, the way that the companies have developed their attitudes about this, I think it all goes in the direction of ever stronger standards. So in a way, it might even be easier than it was for us in the Obama administration to work with the industry toward ever increasing fuel efficiency, which is crucial because the transportation sector is producing the most greenhouse gas emissions and increasingly more than other parts of the economy.
There's debate in the Democratic Party, as always seems to happen after an election, about, the direction of the party or who went too hard on one issue, like the Green New Deal. How has the sort of the rise of the left wing of the party in the last couple of years, how has that affected the discussion around some of these issues that you've been working on for a while?
Yeah, I think the rise of the Green New Deal, the Sunrise Movement, the sort of community that is really pushing ambitious action on climate change has got to get a lot of credit for creating energy around this and driving the conversation. If you remember, in the Democratic primary, the candidates were all pressed about their positions on climate change and the clean energy transition. And so I think the Green New Deal created a focal point for discussion. So you have to give it some credit for keeping climate change on the priority list. And, the Biden campaign adopted some very forward-leaning positions, partly as a credit to that movement. I think now the challenge is delivering, and it becomes harder in divided government. It becomes harder if the Senate is run by the Republicans. And there's going to need to be some, detailed, patient legislating, some working across the lines to try to get some agreements through. That's just going to take some really hard work and dedication. I don't know what's possible in Congress, but at the same time, as we've discussed, you have to be prepared to really press the executive levers that you control. So in the government you run, you make sure climate is a priority across the board. It's a priority in your diplomacy, in international relations. You deal with it with countries in bilateral negotiations. Climate is a priority in all of your diplomatic contexts. Climate is a priority for your Treasury Department. The Department of Defense cares about climate and energy efficiency because they consume huge amounts of energy in warfighting. In other words, you embed a concern about climate across the executive branch. And that helps you not just accomplish greenhouse gas reductions, but create a kind of interest and priority around making progress with whatever powers the executive branch has. That's the kind of thing Biden has to do while he's pushing on legislation in the Congress.
There's talk that there could be trouble if Biden tries to nominate somebody who's too far left for some of these cabinet positions. And I'm just wondering, how important are the actual personnel that Biden would install into a cabinet, say for the EPA or the Department of Energy? How big a deal is that?
I think it's a very big deal. Traditionally, presidents get their cabinets, traditionally out of a sense of comedy and historical practice. The Senate confirms the president's cabinet. So if McConnell and the Republicans take the position that they are not going to confirm the picks of President Biden, he will have to resort to other strategies to fill those posts with acting administrators. And that's really in nobody's interest. That's would be very unfortunate. But one way or another, I'm pretty sure Biden's going to fill the posts with really terrific people who are aligned with his agenda. It matters who's at the top of these agencies. It matters that they're expert, that they get the issues, that they have political skills. They can go into Congress and defend their agency actions. They can argue for their budgets. They can push internally to get rules across the finish line. You need really skilled people who understand the mission of the agency and are committed to it. And I think the Biden team is ready to go. I mean, I would expect them to have already been thinking very hard about these posts, and Biden committed to a diverse cabinet and a diverse set of appointees. So I'd be looking for variety too among them on all measures. So I'm not sure who it will be yet, but I think they're going to be very keen to put some of these rules back in place that the Trump administration so badly weakened. And the other thing I would say is they're also going to have to rebuild the agencies to some extent, because Trump didn't just deregulate to an unprecedented degree. He really chipped away at the core capacities of these agencies. He undermined the career staff. He maligned the career staff. He moved them around. He demoted them. He sidestepped them. He disregarded science. He really eroded the heart and soul of the federal government. And I think the Biden team is going to have to be committed to rebuilding expertise, commitment to science, and the like.
All right. Well, Professor Jody Freeman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends. The podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Reed Frazier. We'll see you next time.